Hello and welcome to the final lecture for this class, Reconstruction. This was a political reform movement which took place immediately following the end of the Civil War, as many tried to heal the nation's wounds in the aftermath of the most devastating war in American history. There are a few themes to be addressed in this lecture. The first topic will be a profile of the various leaders involved with Reconstruction. 2 presidents will be discussed, as well as some of the members of Congress. Secondly, the various goals and accomplishments of those leaders will be analyzed. Different groups emerged, which had their own attitudes about the actions the nation should take. Finally, the end of Reconstruction will also be discussed. There's one thing you probably want to keep in mind as you're going through this lecture or doing any reading on this subject. That would be an evaluation of Reconstruction. Do you think this political reform movement was a success or a failure? A little background information and definition of what is meant by the term Reconstruction would be a good place to start. The Civil War had ended by 1865, yet there were several results of the war which had to be addressed. First, there was a tremendous loss of life. This was the bloodiest war in American history. How could the nation recover? Secondly, the South's economy was destroyed. In what ways would it be rebuilt? Finally, what would become of the former slaves? Would they be full citizens? Would land be distributed to them? Leaders throughout the country weren't sure. Here is a textbook definition of Reconstruction's primary focus. It was the process of putting the nation back together following the Civil War. Presidents had their own attitudes toward Reconstruction. The first president who had to deal with it was Abraham Lincoln. He had a unique plan to reunite the nation. Abraham Lincoln issued his Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction during the war in 1863. Some people called this the 10% Plan because of its leniency and provisions. Essentially, 10% of the voters in the Confederate States had to accept 2 things: emancipation of the slaves, and they had to swear loyalty to the Union. Also, high-ranking Confederate officials could participate in this new government, but in order to do so, they had to receive a presidential pardon. Lastly, once these provisions were met, a state could return to the Union. This plan was noted for its leniency, as Lincoln wanted to make it easy for the Confederate States to return to the Union. Supporters of a lenient peace saw their hopes dashed when Abraham Lincoln attended a play in April of 1865. He was shot at point-blank range by the famous actor John Wilkes Booth while attending the play Our American Cousin at the now famous Ford's Theater. The nation mourned its fallen president, as is shown with this image on the left. You may want to visit the website below, as it identifies several of the conspiracy theories associated with the Lincoln assassination. Many theories have run rampant because Lincoln wasn't the only person targeted for assassination on that date. Several others, including members of Lincoln's cabinet as well as his vice president, were supposed to be killed on that night. However, only Booth was successful in killing his target. There were several others who also influenced Reconstruction at this time. We'll talk about them next. Following the death of Abraham Lincoln, there were a variety of people who began to influence Reconstruction. However, it might be best to focus on just 3. The first 2, Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, were members of Congress, and they were radical Republicans. Andrew Johnson was Lincoln's vice president, who assumed the presidency following Lincoln's assassination. You may or may not be familiar with the phrase radical Republicans. In this context, they were members of the Republican Party with 2 primary goals. They wanted to punish the South for causing the Civil War, and they also fought to protect the rights of former slaves. Below is a hyperlink for more information about radical Republicans. Thaddeus Stevens was a leading radical Republican in the House of Representatives. For many years, he was committed to the cause of racial equality and demonstrated this while planning for his own funeral. He asked that he be buried in a cemetery alongside African Americans. His goal when it came to Reconstruction was to focus on economic opportunity for former slaves and supported a program which would distribute land to blacks. Another radical Republican was this man, Charles Sumner, who was also a member of the United States Senate. In the years leading up to the Civil War, he was a staunch opponent of slavery and continued to fight on behalf of the rights of African Americans after the end of the war. This image depicts an event which took place in 1857 on the floor of the United States Senate just a few years before the start of the Civil War. Charles Sumner had previously delivered a speech in which he criticized slavery in general and slaveholders in particular. Preston Brooks, who was a member of the United States House of Representatives, took offense at this speech. He went to the floor of the Senate and physically beat Sumner over the head with a cane. This demonstrated how heated the division had become among Americans in the years before the Civil War. During the era of Reconstruction, Sumner used his influence in the Senate to fight and secure citizenship and political rights for former slaves. In addition to these radical Republicans, there's another individual who influenced Reconstruction who eventually found himself impeached. The third person to influence events following the death of Lincoln was this man, Andrew Johnson. Johnson had formerly been a senator from Tennessee and served as vice president before Lincoln's death. He was a bit of a controversial running mate for Lincoln because of his roots in Tennessee and the fact that Johnson was a Democrat. This map identifies several southern states during the Civil War. Notice where Tennessee is located. Johnson's home state of Tennessee fought with the Confederacy during the war, yet Johnson was the only Southern senator to remain loyal to the Union. This is why Lincoln chose Johnson to be his vice president when he ran for re-election in 1864. Lincoln demonstrated his desire to preserve the Union by choosing a Democrat, Lincoln was a Republican, who supported the Union over his home state. Many were concerned how a Southerner would respond in the White House to Reconstruction, and Johnson undertook some controversial actions which added to this concern. He issued some 13,000 pardons, many of which went to former members of the Confederacy, which made many uneasy. He then demonstrated his lack of concern for the rights of former slaves when he took no action as several states began to pass what were called black codes. Black codes became law in several states of the former Confederacy. Essentially, these established conditions which were very similar to slavery for African Americans. Typical regulations barred blacks from leaving plantations. In most states, interracial marriages were prohibited, and African Americans could neither serve on juries nor testify in court against whites. You may click on the hyperlinks below to view websites for additional information on black codes. Johnson also came into conflict with members of Congress because of his opposition to the Freedmen's Bureau. This organization was created in order to issue things like food, clothing, and medical supplies. In general, it was designed to oversee relief activities created to help former slaves. They also established many schools for black children. Here we see one of these newly established schools. I don't know if you can tell this from the picture, but we see black teachers and students, all of whom are barefoot. The Bureau also helped to reunify families which had been separated when slavery had been legal. Congress voted to extend the funding for this program, however Johnson vetoed its renewal in 1866. Largely due to his lack of concern for the rights of former slaves, Andrew Johnson became the first president in American history to be impeached. There's often a lot of confusion associated with the term impeachment, so I'd like to offer a bit of detail. The Constitution identifies a two-step process for the removal of an official like the president or a federal judge. The first of these steps would be impeachment. This means to bring official charges against the president. To do so requires a majority vote in the House of Representatives. The second step would be a trial. This would take place in the United States Senate, and each individual senator would act as a juror. A two-thirds majority vote is needed to remove the president from office. The hyperlink below is to an award-winning website covering the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. Johnson was impeached by the House of Representatives in 1868. However, there were not enough votes in the United States Senate to remove him from office. While he did remain president, he was largely ineffective in gaining support for his programs in Congress. So in many ways, after his impeachment, it was members of Congress who controlled Reconstruction. We see a new shift in Reconstruction in 1868 with so-called radical or congressional Reconstruction. Following Johnson's impeachment, radical Republicans began to pass legislation designed in part to punish the South. One of the best examples of Congress asserting its authority over the President can be seen with a series of Reconstruction Acts. The first passed in 1867, but was followed by similar additional bills in 1868. First, the states of the former Confederacy were militarily occupied by U.S. troops. In essence, part of the United States became occupied territory. This map does a good job of identifying the 5 military districts into which the South was divided and militarily occupied. Only one state escaped this occupation, and that was Tennessee. The Reconstruction Act also identified a way in which Southern states could be readmitted into the Union. In order to return, they were required to ratify the 14th Amendment. The reason why Tennessee escaped occupation was that it had already ratified the amendment in 1866. Another important topic associated with radical or congressional Reconstruction would be the so-called Civil War amendments, numbers 13, 14, and 15. Each of these amendments address the status of former slaves following the Civil War. A partial text of this groundbreaking amendment to our Constitution is included below. However, simply put, the 13th Amendment outlawed, or prohibited, slavery. Many have argued that the 14th Amendment is the single most important amendment to the Constitution outside of the Bill of Rights. It did a variety of things. First, it ensured former slaves would be considered citizens, as it declared that all persons born in the United States were citizens of the United States. Secondly, it guaranteed equal treatment under the law for all citizens. Another provision punished states that denied voting rights to all of its male citizens. Because access to voting rights was considered to be such an important issue, Congress proposed the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment specifically guaranteed the right to vote for all black men. In the years immediately following the passage of this amendment, many African American men exercised this power, as is shown in the painting on the right. It should be noted that while the passage of these Civil War amendments demonstrated tremendous political gains for African Americans, there was no major redistribution of land. Most former slaves continued to remain tied to the land as sharecroppers for many years. This system of sharecropping will be discussed in more detail in lecture number 4, The United States at 1900. Now I'd like to talk about how the election of 1876 helped to bring Reconstruction to an end. Reconstruction came to an end by 1877 as a result of a political deal involving the presidential election in 1876. In that year, 2 candidates ran for the White House, but it was unclear who had won because it was a contested election. The Democratic candidate was Samuel Tilden, the former reformer from New York. The Republican was the 3-term governor of Ohio, Rutherford B. Hayes. The problem with the election of 1876 dealt with voter irregularities in South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. Both sides accused the other of cheating, and both claimed victory in each of those states. To rectify this problem, a commission was established to find a resolution to this issue. Members of the Electoral Commission met in the Wormley Hotel located in Washington, D.C. Initially, there were 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and 1 Independent as members of the commission. However, the Independent faced a great deal of pressure and resigned. The second makeup of the commission included 7 Democrats and 8 Republicans. Well, those 7 Democrats and 8 Republicans were able to reach a solution dealing with this contested election. This was called the Compromise of 1877. First, Hayes became the new president. This made many in the North, and Republicans, happy. Secondly, the military occupation of the South ended. This made many white Southerners happy. However, when the military occupation of the South came to an end, the rights of former slaves were no longer protected. Below is a website for more information about this compromise. One final topic to consider would be an evaluation of this era of Reconstruction. How would you evaluate Reconstruction? Some historians argue it was a success. It was a success because slavery was abolished and African Americans were guaranteed equal treatment with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. In the 20th century, this led to expanded rights for all Americans. Other historians argue that Reconstruction was a failure because after 1877 there were rights guaranteed on paper but not in reality, particularly once the North turned its back on former slaves and the troops left the South. What you want to do is to think critically about this subject and come to your own conclusions. I hope you learned something new today about Reconstruction and civil rights in the years immediately following the Civil War. The next few slides will cover some of the sources used for this presentation, as well as hyperlinks to websites where you can find additional information about the topics discussed.